So the Las Vegas Raiders ended up losing to the Miami Dolphins 19-34. The game was a lot closer than what the final score indicated, but we found out a lot about this team, specifically with the offensive coordinator and Scott Turner, and we're going to start right away talking about Turner. As you guys know, the Raiders had high expectations coming into the season, but of course, with Wilkins being the offensive coordinator, nothing really happened on the offense side of the football. And we made a change after the Raiders ultimately lost against the Bengals. We had a bye week, and this was the first game with the new offensive coordinator. And I'll be the first to tell you guys, I think Scott Turner looked so much better than what we had seen from Wilkins. And I think a big part of what we saw from Scott Turner, especially early on in the game, was we got a lot more motion, we got a lot more end arounds, things looked better, spacing was better, right? Things just overall from a offensive design and spacing perspective looked a lot cleaner for the Raiders. And I know some people are like, hey, we don't need to win any meaningless games. We've got to lose the rest of the games to ultimately tank for that quarterback. And I do agree with that partly. But we do have to figure out if the Raiders have a offensive coordinator in Scott Turner. Right, everybody wants to fire AP. Well, I shouldn't everybody, but a lot of Raider fans want to fire AP, but that's not happening. Antonio Pierce is going to be the Raiders coach going into next season. The Raiders don't plan to move off of him at any point. And obviously, when you really consider the fact that the Raiders aren't moving off of Antonio Pierce, what that means is you got to find an offensive coordinator that can go with Antonio Pierce. If you guys remember, the Detroit Lions started 0-11 and fired Anthony Lynn in 2021. While Ben Johnson took over, Ben Johnson looked so much better. He got the offensive coordinator job, and now he's the hottest name in football. I'm not saying Scott Turner can take that same approach, but you never know if Scott Turner ends up being a really, really good offensive coordinator. And based off of what we saw against Dolphins, I felt like our offense was a lot better for pretty much the entire game. Coming out, Scott Turner not only had a lot more motions, he had a lot more eye candy kind of going on in the backfield. The spacing looked better. Guys were getting open. And it just didn't seem like guys were confused and things just didn't make sense. You know, the plays we were calling in a specific time we were ultimately calling them, it just flowed well, right? It just looked good. Guys were open. Brock Bowers had a monster game, 13 catches, 124 yards. And our offense utilized Brock Bowers as the focal point, right? We made sure to feed Brock Bowers. And it's almost like Scott Turner just understands what you have to do when you have a guy like Brock Bowers, or just how a general NFL offense should work, right? To me, our offense looks so much better. And I think Scott Turner deserves a lot of credit for what we kind of saw now. Only 19 points, right? It's not like the Raiders scored 50 points. But we do also have to recognize we do have quarterback limitations with Gardner Minshew. On top of that, the first two drives we had the football, we drove right downfield. Now, we weren't able to actually score a touchdown on those two drives, but we drove right downfield. And we got close both times. And ultimately, we ended up getting stopped. And again, quarterback limitations. We, for some reason, rolled out with Zamir White on the first drive of the game, or for the first, basically, half of the game. And that did not make sense to me, right? Rolling out there with Zamir White made no sense. The guy had 5 carries today for the Raiders. He had 9 yards. Right, Zamir White is not a good running back, so it didn't make sense to me why the Raiders stuck with him and ultimately had him start the game for the Raiders. It would have made more sense to roll forward with Alexander Mattison. Now, maybe he's dealing with an injury, but Mattison had 5 carries for 19 yards, right? So he had 10 more yards than Zamir White on the same amount of touches, and he had 3 catches for 50 yards. So to me, Madison's definitely a better running back. I'm not sure why they didn't stick with Madison regardless of that. Our run game was really not a factor this game, and I think that kind of slowed down the Raiders' offensive production as well. I think Gardner Minshew was okay, right? He wasn't great. He played within the structure of the offense. And of course, I think a big part of what we kind of saw with the Raiders in this game is we were not able to have success running the football. So a lot of it was through the air, a lot of it was passing the football. And then the defense really struggled today as well, and I think that's another thing we'll touch on here in a second. But I liked some of what I saw from Scott Turner. Now, we'll see how he continues over the next couple of weeks. I think it's very, very important the Raiders find their offensive coordinator. Now, Scott Turner is obviously the first guy that's going to get that chance to prove himself, and he gets to prove himself by actually getting out there and trying to do it on the field. And if he doesn't work out, the Raiders are going to be in a great spot because then we can ultimately move, Scott Turner back to pass game coordinator, or just, right out, fire him and bring in a brand new offensive coordinator with a brand new coaching staff. Regardless, Antonio Pierce is not expected to go anywhere. So I think the Raiders are in a good spot right now, right? Obviously, we're 2-8. We'll probably end up with the top 5 pick. We'll probably end up drafting a quarterback. And I think that's exactly where the Raiders should be right now. That's what we should be looking forward to. Gardner Minshew, I think, also looked a lot better. And I think we also got to realize that even if you bring in a rookie quarterback next year, do you really want a rookie quarterback to start as your starting quarterback right away? Right? Or would you rather say, hey, let's keep Gardner Minshew? He's a bridge quarterback. He can come in there. He can potentially win some games. Maybe you give him 4 or 5 weeks and he wins 2 games next year. He's 2-3 before you switch over, right? It's just lower expectations. So, uh, I think the Raiders looked a lot better. Now, we do got to figure out the run game, and we got to get our wide receivers the football more. If there's one thing that I think the Raiders kind of struggled with, it was pushing the ball downfield. We didn't really get any of our guys the ball downfield. I think Trey Tucker had one catch that went for like 22 yards. But generally speaking, it didn't look that good, right? From the wide receiver perspective. And maybe that's because of the fact that the Miami Dolphins have a really, really good secondary. I think got Jalen Ramsey. They got a couple other guys that are pretty solid in that secondary. But I want to see more from the Raiders offense, especially getting some of the wide receivers the ball. And I want to see the run game have a little bit more success. And I do think if you roll forward with Alexander Mattison, I think our run game will be a lot better. The offensive line, I felt like did a much better job as well. Everything just looked better, right? And I really wanted to start and kind of emphasize on that. But I do want to talk about some of the struggles that the Raiders had a little bit. The run game was really, really, really bad. And I don't think that was because of the offensive line as opposed to as much of maybe the running backs that got the touches weren't great. We gave Zamir White 5 carries early on. That wasn't really that good. And then we brought in Alexander Mattison, and Mattison averaged almost 4 yards per attempt, but Mattison ended up getting hurt, so he was knocked out of this game. So at that point, the Raiders really didn't have a running back. So the Raiders got to figure out that running back position. The trade deadline's passed at this point. Maybe you look at some of the free agents that are available. There's some running backs that you can bring in. They might be a little bit older. Or you can give Dylan Labe a real look and let this guy actually have some carries. We'll see what ends up happening as we go into next week. But the run game has to get fixed. And again, I don't think it's the guys up front. I think it's just more so you got to stick with it. And then the defense has to do a much better job. I think the Raiders lost this game against the Dolphins in part because of the defense. It wasn't 100% on the defensive side of the football. It wasn't 100% their fault, right? But you got to get stops when it ultimately matters. The Raiders were down essentially by 5 points at one point. You got to get off the field, and we weren't able to. And the Dolphins ultimately ended up picking 1-2 first downs up, and then they had Jonnu Smith, their tight end, wide open on a busted coverage. Wasn't 100% sure if that was on Divine Diablo or Robert Spillane. It looked like they just kind of left this guy wide open. Diablo kind of ended up blitzing, and no one picked him up. And it looked like it was man coverage, but we'll watch the tape and we'll reanalyze kind of what should have happened within that play. But you had a busted coverage. That one went for a 57-yard touchdown. You got to do a better job if you're the Raiders getting off the field when it matters. Because had the Raiders been able to get off the field and you're only down by 5 points, maybe you're able to have a little bit of success, right? Maybe you end up being able to score a touchdown and you go up in this game, right? And again, I know there's the whole argument, do you want to win games at this point? Probably not, right? But you do want to show improvement, and you do want to make sure that, as a team, as a roster, you're able to keep guys engaged, and these guys that are going to become free agents this year, you want to make sure they're willing to come back to the Raiders, right? You don't want them to feel like, hey, we need to go to a different team because the Raiders are never going to win. All right, so whatever that ultimately takes, the Raiders got to be able to do that. Now, Gardner Minshew did throw an interception. We should talk about this play as well. The broadcast crew did point it out that it looked like Jacoby Myers may have went the wrong way on his route. The Raiders do run option routes, right? They have options. It's called the choice route. Essentially, depending on where the guy is, you might either hit an out route or you might curl or hit some sort of hitch back towards the inside. And the thing with those plays is every NFL offense designs those type of concepts, right? For the Raiders, it just doesn't look good at this point, right? We've had moments even before Scott Turner took over where those plays did not work. And it's not the wide receivers, right? Like, it's not Jacoby Myers' fault. It's not Devontae Adams' fault. Gardner Minshew and the wide receiver are just seeing two different things. And I think you're at the point where you just got to try taking those type of route concepts out. Not that the Raiders are probably going to win, right? We're already down by 12 points. There are 4 minutes left at that point regardless. So we were likely not going to win the game anyways. But you just got to do a better job if you're the quarterback. Now, the defense obviously did not benefit the Raiders, did not help us out at all. That's another thing we can just really touch on. The Raiders have a lot of injuries. Nate Hobbs was knocked out of the game against the Bengals. He did not play this week. Christian Wilkins has obviously been out for, I believe this was his 4th game that he's been out. He could potentially come off the injured reserve over the next week or two. And then Malcolm Koonce is out for the rest for this season. He's been out, right? He hasn't played at all. Those 3 guys are the Raiders' 2nd, 3rd, and 4th best player. You can make the argument Ja'Cory Bennett's maybe the 5th best player, and he was knocked out of this game, I think literally on the first drive of the game. So consider those things right there, right? Consider those things right there. The Raiders had some injuries coming into this week. They had some injuries during the actual game. Even Alexander Mattison got knocked out, right? So injuries haven't really favored the Raiders at this point, and I think it's impacting our defense a lot. And I know some people are going to say, every team has guys get hurt. Other guys got to step in and be able to do their job. It's hard. The Miami Dolphins are one of the best teams in the NFL, specifically because they built a really, really good offense. And with Tua specifically, they're putting up a ton of points. And with the Raiders, you don't have your players. You're not going to be able to win these games. So I think one of the things the Raiders got to do is they got to figure out which guys are good and which guys need to ultimately be replaced, right? The Raiders last year picked up Jack Jones, and Jack Jones looked really, really good. They also picked up a guy in Darnay Holmes, number 30. Holmes had a key penalty, right? The Raiders actually could have gotten off the field when they're down by 5 points, and he ended up getting called for a pass interference. So there's guys like that you got to figure out as well. Is this guy going to actually be here? The Raiders picked up this defensive tackle. I think he was with the Colts before he came to the Raiders. His name is Jonah Lalulu. I think he's a rookie this year, and the guy made a couple of really, really nice, impactful plays for the Raiders. Although we ended up losing, the defense couldn't get stops. There were guys on that defensive side that looked good. Tyree Wilson had some pressures. I think he may have had a strip sack as well. The Raiders have looked good at certain times. Guys have stepped up at certain times. They just haven't been able to come together. Defense is young. Even Clavon Chase is another guy that's kind of stepped in and looked good for the Raiders this year. I think the Raiders just got to really figure it out, really come together, and the defense has to step up and be the defense we expected. Now, that might not be this year, but going into next year, there's a lot of positives we can take out from this season, especially this game against the Dolphins. I thought it was arguably the best game the offense had played this season. We had a couple of the Ravens game was another game in which the offense played pretty well, but I felt like this was one of the best offenses I had seen, and a big part of that was just because things just look cleaner and crisper, essentially, right? So I want to just see what the Raiders continue to build. We'll see as the season kind of ends. Let me know what you guys think, man. What did you guys think about the Raiders' performances, generally speaking? Offense, defense, everything looked a lot better to me, but they got to just continue to improve. They got to just continue to get better, and we'll see as the season kind of finishes. Tomorrow we will have a film breakdown. I kind of want to touch on Jackson Powers-Johnson again because today was the second game he actually started. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of success running the football, and we only ran the ball 10 times with our running backs, right? I guess 11. Amir Abdullah also had 1 carry. But we gave Brock Bowers the ball. We gave Trey Tucker the ball. Jacoby Myers got the ball, right, on end arounds. And that's kind of some of the things you got to just continue to do to keep a defense honest, right? So it's something that I kind of like. But let me know what you guys think, man. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time with another video.